Welcome to Getting It Right by the New Zealand Society of Genealogists. I'm your presenter, Sarah Hewitt. For the notes that accompany this presentation and the other Getting It Right learning resources, please see our website www.genealogy.org.nz.
This presentation is on the Genealogical Proof Standard. This is a methodology that helps us with the genealogist's job. We covered this off in the first presentation, Where to Start. The genealogist's job is to answer a question, a simple one or a complex one. And in the process of answering the question, we need to find sources which provide evidence that prove conclusions about identities and relationships and events. So the GPS is a methodology that helps us with this. It was developed by the Board of Certification for Genealogists in the United States. So there's a few things to note about it. First of all, it's not written in plain English. And sometimes I look at it and I think it's a little bit scary, but actually it's not at all. The second thing is that it's a professional standard. You can follow it to a professional standard if you want, but you don't have to. Just making sure you follow it to some degree will help your research immensely. It's made up of 5 steps, which I'm going to step through individually, and then we'll have a look at it as a whole. So the first step, reasonably exhaustive research has been conducted. Go do some research. That's easy enough. But what about the word exhaustive? How long is a piece of string? What's exhaustive today might not be exhaustive tomorrow. I like to think of it more in terms of, do you know when you haven't done enough research? So let's have a look at an example. It regards the Canterbury Yeomanry Cavalry. This was a militia in Canterbury in the 19th century, which eventually became the Canterbury Mounted Rifles. Now I know from family story and other documents that my great-great-grandfather Jasper Pine O'Callaghan was a member. And I discovered from a funeral notice that his brother Thomas Robert O'Callaghan was also a member. Have we done enough research to answer the question, were they in the CYC at the same time? I hope you said no, because it's definitely not enough information. So where would we look? Well, fortunately, because militias are part of the government, there's government records, and Archives New Zealand hold these militia records. So I went in and got the information on when they joined up. Thomas joined on the 12th of December 1873. Jasper joined up on the 26th of June 1874. If we look at all this research that we see here, we'll note that Thomas died on the 8th of June 1874. Weeks before Jasper joined up. Now I need to add an extra note here, that while we know the who, the where, the when, the how, the what, we do not know the why. We have no information that tells us why Jasper joined up, and it's a key thing to note in your family history research that you might not ever know why. So we figured out when we've done exhaustive research or not. Step 2 is each statement of fact has a complete and accurate source citation. I'm going to first look at what sources are, and then I'll get into the source citation. So what is a source? Generally speaking, we're looking for original documents. These sources fall into 2 categories: primary sources, which are contemporary to the events, and secondary sources, which are usually written later. Sometimes they'll include analysis and bring together a wide array of sources. And a really good secondary source will include a list of primary sources. Quite often encyclopedias are used as an example of a secondary source. But if you're reading a book on the history of Christchurch or the Maori Battalion, this is a secondary source. A second type of source are transcripts. In our presentation on searching, I go through some of the problems that you may face with transcript records. So please go and have a look at it. So let's have a look at an example. This is the birth certificate of my great uncle Jerry. Have a quick look at it. Can you tell me what it's the primary source for? Yep, it's the primary source for his birth. But what's it a secondary source for? Because there's quite a lot of information on it. if you've had a good look at it, you'll see it's a secondary source for quite a lot of information about his parents. It gives their ages, their occupations, where they were born, and when and where they were married. It's a secondary source because it's pointing you in the direction of other records, such as their marriage certificate and potentially their birth certificates. But I've tricked you on this one. And do you know how that is? Well, this is actually a transcript. It's typed. In 1902, when Uncle Jerry was born, official records were still kept handwritten. And you'll note down the bottom that it says that it was issued on the 12th day of June 1934. It's not contemporary to the events. Let's have a look now at source citations. This is the important part of point 2. It's writing down where you found the information. It is very much a personal decision on how much you record, but you're really trying to record enough so that if you need to, you can go and find that record again. And of course, if you have family tree software, it makes life a lot easier. Source citations. I view them as being on a spectrum. So if we use Uncle Jerry's birth certificate as an example, at one end, we can just write nothing. It's not the best idea. We could just write that we have a birth certificate. We could add a bit more detail and say it's a New Zealand birth certificate. Or at the other end of the spectrum, we can give the full details of where that information is recorded if we need to go and find it again. It is up to you where on that spectrum you fall, but I would suggest nothing is not a good idea. I have recorded a birth date for Uncle Jerry's mum Greta, but I have no source citation for it, and I have absolutely no idea where it came from. And by not knowing where it came from, I don't know if it's correct. And that's why we put down our source citations. So now that we've done our research and written down where it all came from, it's time for step 3. The evidence is reliable and has been skillfully correlated and interpreted. What on earth does that mean? Well, it means we've taken a step back and looked at the big picture. Now, hopefully, we're coming up with this beautiful picture that's like a Hans Holbein painting, where you can see the detail of the individual strands of the feather. Sometimes, when we're using more indirect evidence or circumstantial evidence, it might come out looking like a pretty Renoir painting. You can still make out what it says, but it's not quite as sharp as if you're using only direct evidence. But if your picture looks like this, I'm agreed, you possibly need to go and do a bit more research or recheck the research you've done already. We want our big picture to make sense. Let's look at an example and see if you think this makes sense. We have a Thomas Blythe. He was born in Woolwich in Kent. He grew up, he got married, and he had some kids. Then committed a crime in Warwickshire, for which he was transported to Tasmania. He left his wife and children at home in Kent. In Australia, he got a second wife and then proceeded to have children with both wives at the same time. What sort of picture have we painted here? Are we on a Holbein, a Renoir, or a Magritte? I think we've hit the Magritte end of the spectrum. In the 19th century, it just wasn't feasible for him to be having children on opposite sides of the world, especially since he was a convict in Tasmania. So looking at the big picture shows that we've gone wrong somewhere. Sometimes looking at the big picture produces this. Some of you may recognize it. It's a duck rabbit. Can you see the duck? Can you see the rabbit? By stepping back and looking at the big picture, you may discover that your duck is actually a rabbit. Or worse, you can't tell whether it's a duck or a rabbit. Now, if you can't tell, the answer is go and do some more research. But it is something to bear in mind when you're looking at the big picture, that it may turn all the assumptions you had already on their head. So we've done some research, cited our sources, and had a step back and looked at the big picture. Step 4 looks at the big picture a bit more. Any contradictory evidence has been resolved. So what does that mean? Well, it's asking us what happens when our picture looks like this. We've got a beautiful train, but it's not coming out of a tunnel, it's coming out of a mantelpiece. Or alternately, we have a beautiful mantelpiece and there's a train coming out of it. There are things in there that are inconsistent. 99.99% of the time, records that are inconsistent because they're not your family. They're just wrong, so you discard them. But sometimes there are records that have information in them that's perfectly correct, but also information in them that's perfectly incorrect. Let's have a look at an example. This is the death certificate, a transcript, of my great-great-grandfather Robert Johnston, and there are two inconsistencies in here. First of all, his age at death. He died in 1925, so he would have been born about 1846. He always said he was born in 1851, and to add to the complication, further records in Scotland show that he was probably born about 1844. What's the answer? Well, he lied about his age. He married a woman significantly younger than him, and he didn't want her father to forbid the marriage. So he wasn't very good at telling the truth about his age, and that is reflected in the records. So the first reason you might find inconsistencies is people lie. The second one has to do with his parents' names. The surnames are actually correct, Johnston being his father's name and Young being his mother's maiden name. However, the first names are both wrong. His parents were John and Helen. So what happened here? Well, a key thing to note about death certificates is they're not filled in by the person who is deceased. They're filled in by people who survived the deceased person. And in this case, the family members got a bit confused because, and you're going to have to bear with me here because it gets a bit complicated, Robert's wife, Elizabeth, had a sister called Margaret who was married to James Johnston. So when the death certificate was completed, they just got a bit confused. And that's the second reason why there may be inconsistencies. People don't know, or they made mistakes. Don't be surprised to find these things. We've finished step 4 now, and we're up to step 5. The conclusion has been soundly reasoned and coherently written. This isn't writing down the story of your family. This is writing down how the evidence fits together to make your picture. Now, some of the time, especially when you're using direct evidence, you might not need to articulate this. But I would really recommend, if you're using circumstantial evidence, that you do write down how the sources you've put together paint your picture. Because otherwise, you'll come back and you'll look at it and go, how on earth did I come to that conclusion? And then you'll go and revisit your whole research and do the whole thing all over again and waste a lot of time. If you've written down how you got the conclusion, you can look through it and go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes you might look at it and go, what on earth was I thinking? But if you have it there, it will save you time and effort. I'm now quickly going to recap. Step 1, we've done some research, and we're aware when it's not exhaustive. Step 2, we've written down where we found all our sources from. Step 3, we've taken a step back, looked at the big picture. Is everything making sense? Step 4, are any of the little niggly bits that don't make sense explainable? And number 5, we've written down how our conclusion was reached. And that's it for this presentation. Thank you for joining us. The next presentation in this series is recording conventions. For further information, see our website www.genealogy.org.nz, and we'd like to thank the Wellington Masonic Club for their support in making these presentations. See you next time.